So, if I asked you to name the most influential culinary laboratory in 16th century Europe, you'd probably guess Paris, right?
Right, or maybe Florence. That's usually where people's minds go.
Exactly. But you'd actually be wrong. Because if you wanted to find the absolute cutting edge of gastronomic science back then, the place where modern European cooking was essentially being beta tested, you had to look behind the heavy, closed wooden doors of the Vatican.
Which is pretty wild to think about.
It really is. I mean, it's a place most of us associate entirely with, marble and incense and theology. Oh, and global diplomacy, of course.
Yeah, the institutional weight of the place is massive.
Yeah.
But beneath all of that, there is this deeply guarded 2,000-year-old gastronomic memory.
A completely hidden culinary culture. And welcome to the deep dive, by the way. Our mission today is to take the source documents we've gathered and really explore this highly secretive world.
It's essentially an invisible ecosystem. Millions of people look to the Vatican for spiritual guidance, but they're completely unaware of this vast network of kitchens and pantries operating silently in the background.
Right, and that's exactly what we want to share with you today. We're going to examine the fascinating tension between sheer palace grandeur and, well, monastic simplicity. We want to figure out what the spiritual leader of millions actually eats.
Because looking at those choices, what's served, how it's prepared, is incredibly revealing. It is honestly one of the most accurate ways to understand a leader's true approach to power.
Yeah, you can learn so much just by looking at a dinner plate, maybe even more than by reading official speeches.
Absolutely. It shows how they navigate tradition and, their own humanity under immense pressure.
So to really understand the Vatican's food culture today, we actually have to clear up a pretty major historical misconception.
We do.
When we think of the codification of high-end cooking, we usually think of the French. But according to our sources, the Vatican kitchen historically wrote the blueprint.
They really did. If we're going to talk about Vatican food, we have to start with the sheer historical weight bearing down on those dining tables.
Yeah.
And that requires looking back to the Renaissance,
Right.
specifically to a man named Bartolomeo Scappi. He was the personal chef to Pope Pius V. And in 1570, he published this massive text called Opera dell'arte del cucinare.
Which translates to a work on the art of cooking. And I was looking through the sources on this. This wasn't just like a collection of cute family recipes handed down from his grandmother.
No, not at all. It is widely considered one of history's most comprehensive and influential cookbooks. It was a monumental achievement in technical documentation.
Wow.
Yeah, Scappi wasn't just throwing ingredients into pots hoping for the best. The Vatican kitchens of the 1570s were systematically laying the foundations for modern European culinary arts.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I think people hear 1570 cookbook and they naturally imagine, I don't know, a chaotic medieval kitchen roasting a wild boar over an open flame.
Right, a very rough, smoky environment.
Exactly. But what Scappi was doing sounds more like a massive chemistry lab. I mean, they were standardizing heat control, measuring precise ratios, and really figuring out the mechanics of emulsifying sauces centuries before it was common practice.
Yes, the codification of modern sauce making basically starts there, along with the rigorous systematization of sugar use and the elevation of really complex layered pastries.
It's just so fascinating if you think about it. The Vatican kitchens of that era functioned a lot like an early incubator. Like they were the Silicon Valley of the Renaissance, standardizing the tech of modern cooking so it could eventually be exported to the rest of the continent.
I like the incubator analogy, but considering the scale, I would actually liken it more to the Apollo program of its day.
Oh, wow. The Apollo program.
Yeah, because it was state-sponsored, backed by a virtually limitless budget, and entirely focused on demonstrating absolute supremacy. What's fascinating here is that the Vatican at that time wasn't just a religious center.
Right. It was a major geopolitical powerhouse.
Precisely. The food that Scappi was preparing wasn't just about feeding the Pope and his cardinals. It was a deliberate, highly calculated projection of influence.
So it was basically soft power executed on a dining room table.
Exactly that. When foreign dignitaries and ambassadors visited, the meals were quite literally designed to intimidate them.
I mean, nothing says we're in charge like a structurally perfect giant sugar sculpture, right?
Yet the sheer complexity of a perfectly executed pastry wasn't just delicious, it was a message. The Vatican was effectively telling the world, we have mastered the physical world as completely as we govern the spiritual one.
That is such an intense way to look at dinner. Scappi's kitchen was basically a diplomatic weapon used to awe and overwhelm guests.
It completely reframes the entire concept of a kitchen. You aren't just making a meal, you are actively maintaining the cultural dominance of the Papal States through sheer technical perfection.
But that grand, intimidating machinery of Scappi's kitchen eventually hits a very human wall.
It always does.
Right, because you can have the most advanced, historically imposing culinary setup in Europe. But that massive institution ultimately has to bend to the reality of the modern papacy. It has to adapt to the quirks and the nostalgia of whoever happens to be wearing the fisherman's ring.
The Papal signet ring, yes. And that is really the defining tension of the Vatican. The institution is ancient, rigid, and built for eternity.
Right.
But the individual who is elected to occupy the throne is just a human being, a man shaped by his own distinct childhood, his geography, and his personal memories.
The system essentially has to accommodate the man.
Exactly. And when we look at the menus of the recent popes in our sources, that individuality immediately overrides all of that historical grandeur.
We see that so clearly. Like if we look at Pope John Paul II, this is a man who carried the immense geopolitical weight of the Cold War, an absolute giant of the 20th century.
A profoundly influential figure, yes.
But his diet wasn't built on Renaissance excess at all. Our sources note that he desperately missed the heavy, hearty foods of his Polish roots. He specifically, and apparently quite frequently, craved pierogi.
Traditional Polish dumplings. Yes, they are dense, comforting, and deeply tethered to his homeland. It's a profound contrast to those grand geopolitical sauces of Scappi we were just talking about.
A huge contrast. And then the papacy transitions to Pope Benedict VI. The sources describe him as this quintessential Bavarian gentleman.
This shifted the entire Vatican kitchen once again to reflect his background.
Right, he had this clear affinity for classic German pastries and a noted love for just simple orange juice in the morning.
Which reflects a highly structured, distinctly Bavarian routine, very different from his predecessor. And then, of course, the papacy shifts again with the election of the current pontiff, Pope Francis.
Yeah, who comes from Argentina and stays incredibly true to his modest roots. His daily meals are remarkably simple, usually just like grilled chicken and fresh salads.
Very austere.
Very. But he did bring his own deeply ingrained taste of home into the Vatican walls dulce de leche.
Ah, yes. That rich, sweet Argentine caramel.
Exactly. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. I look at this list, pierogi, German pastries, dulce de leche, and I have to wonder about the perception of power.
How so?
Well, does knowing that a globally revered, almost mythic figure fundamentally relies on heavy Polish dumplings or sweet caramel change how we view their authority? I mean, does reducing their palate to childhood comfort foods humanize them almost too much?
That's a valid question.
It's just hard to reconcile the image of the Supreme Pontiff with someone eagerly awaiting a spoonful of caramel.
I get that, but I actually don't think it diminishes their authority at all. I think it provides really necessary context for their survival in the role.
Survival?
Yes, because we have to consider the absolute isolation of the papacy.
Yeah.
It is an office that carries a crushing spiritual and political burden. These menus synthesize a deep, universal human need for an anchor.
Because without that anchor, the isolation would just be completely overwhelming.
Exactly. When a person is elevated to a position where millions treat them as an intermediary between heaven and earth, they require something that actively tethers them to their own mortal reality.
So a plate of pierogi or a taste of dulce de leche isn't just a snack to satisfy a craving.
No, it's a visceral sensory mechanism. It connects them to their mother's kitchen, to their childhood, to a specific time before the entire weight of the world was placed on their shoulders.
Wow.
It reveals that the need for roots is inescapable, regardless of the power one holds.
That makes perfect sense. The institution demands a pope, but the man demands his memories.
Very well put.
But, these personal tastes don't exist in a vacuum. They interact with and sometimes directly disrupt the ancient rules of the Vatican. Because eating in this environment isn't just about what is on the plate. It's actually governed by centuries of strict protocol.
And historically, the most significant of those protocols was the tradition of the Pope dining alone.
Which, honestly, to a modern ear, sounds incredibly lonely. I mean, just imagine sitting at this massive table, surrounded by priceless frescoes, eating your soup in total silence, while a bunch of aides just watch you.
It does definitely clash with our modern sensibilities about shared meals and community. But it is crucial to understand the mechanism behind that rule.
Right. The sources are clear that it wasn't just him being antisocial.
No, historically, the Pope eating alone was never an act of arrogance. It was a deeply ingrained tradition designed to visually reinforce the Pope's distinct spiritual status.
How does eating alone do that?
Well, eating is fundamentally a mortal bodily necessity, right? By undertaking that bodily function alone, the Pope maintained a deliberate distance. It elevated him above the daily, mundane realities of the papal court.
Ah, I see. It's the physical manifestation of his spiritual separation.
Yes, but then Pope Francis assumes the papacy, and he essentially dismantles this centuries-old protocol overnight.
Yeah, he decides against living in the traditional, isolated papal apartments entirely. Instead, he chooses to reside in Casa Santa Marta, which is basically a guest house for visiting clergy.
And more importantly, he chooses to eat in their communal dining hall.
Which is wild. He just takes a tray, sits at a regular table, and has his grilled chicken and salad with whoever happens to be there.
Within the context of Vatican history, that is a massive structural disruption. He completely shattered a dining protocol that had defined the visual representation of papal authority for centuries.
And it really reminds us that the Pope is not the only person operating within this closed culinary ecosystem. There are other inhabitants who share this food and have their own distinct culture.
That's true.
I mean, the Vatican is also home to the world's oldest continuous military unit, the Swiss Guards. And according to our sources, they are a massive part of the food culture behind the walls.
The Swiss Guards do occupy a very unique space. They are highly visible in those colorful ceremonial uniforms, but they are an elite, highly trained security force. And to maintain that force, they operate their own dedicated kitchen team within their barracks, which is known as the Cuoco de Garde.
And this is a detail from the sources that absolutely fascinates me. The Swiss Guards actually published a book called the Vatican Cookbook.
Yes, prepared by the guards themselves.
Yeah, and it documents the immense logistics of feeding a standing army right in the middle of Rome. It even details the favorite meals of the popes they've been sworn to protect.
It's a remarkable piece of literature, honestly, because it bridges two worlds, the strict military austerity of the guards and the deep culinary history of the Italian peninsula they inhabit.
But this is where I really want to push back on the typical narrative of military food, because when we think of feeding a modern military unit, we usually think of efficiency.
Rations, MREs, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Meals ready to eat or highly processed protein bars designed strictly for caloric intake. But the source material highlights that one of the absolute staples of the Swiss Guard kitchen is eggplant parmesan.
It is indeed.
I just find it slightly absurd in the best way possible that an elite military unit trained in modern counterterrorism is publishing cookbooks centered around a delicate, heavily layered, labor-intensive dish like eggplant parmesan.
It does seem totally counterintuitive to military efficiency. You picture a halberd and modern weaponry in one hand and a spatula for carefully layering cheese in the other.
Right.
But it really speaks to the mechanism of cultural embedding. You cannot station a group of young men in the heart of Rome for centuries without the local culture deeply permeating their daily lives.
Yeah, that makes sense. The food just seeps into their routine.
Yes, the heady, comforting communal nature of a dish like eggplant parmesan serves a dual purpose. It provides the necessary caloric density for a security force while deeply integrating them into the Italian culinary rhythm.
And the quality of that food is directly tied to a sourcing system that operates completely under the radar. I didn't realize this, but the Vatican isn't just ordering mass-produced food from commercial distributors.
No, they operate a hyperlocal, completely natural sourcing network.
Yeah, a vast amount of their ingredients comes directly from their own agricultural estates at Castel Gandolfo, which is the traditional papal summer residence.
It is a phenomenal logistical operation. The Vatican effectively runs a sovereign microeconomy of agriculture. At Castel Gandolfo, they maintain a completely closed-loop agrarian system.
We're talking about dedicated dairy herds producing milk that is processed into cheese right on site.
Sprawling olive groves that are pressed into proprietary oils.
And free-range poultry, too. All of it funneling fresh produce directly into the Vatican walls on a daily basis.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, all of these seemingly disparate elements, the communal cooking of the Swiss Guards, the closed-loop organic farming at Castel Gandolfo, and Pope Francis's decision to abandon the isolated dining room for a shared table at Casa Santa Marta, they all point toward a very specific philosophy.
They absolutely do.
Dining is, and always has been, a deeply political act. Throughout history, the decisions regarding who you eat with, what you consume, and where your food originates have defined the nature of your power.
So by choosing to eat alongside his clergy, and by prioritizing simple produce grown on their own land, Francis is signaling a leadership style that is radically different from his predecessors.
It is a complete inversion of the Scapi era we discussed earlier.
Right. Where Scapi used food to project intimidating wealth and dominance, this modern approach uses food to project accessibility.
Exactly. It dismantles the elevated isolation. It champions community in a very down-to-earth naturalism. Francis uses his daily meals to communicate a profound theological and political message
Which is what exactly?
that the leadership should be embedded among the people, literally sharing their daily bread rather than hovering above them in solitary splendor.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive by looking for a hidden gastronomic memory behind the heavy doors of the world's smallest state.
We did.
And what the sources reveal is a culinary culture caught in a constant balancing act. It's a system that keeps ancient traditions alive while adapting to the deeply human needs of its leaders.
Hovering right between Bartolomeo Scapi's glorious, intimidating Renaissance banquets and the modest, communal, locally sourced meals we see today.
Exactly. And why should you, as a listener, care about the internal dining habits of the Vatican? Because whether it's Pope Pius V using structural sugar to intimidate rival ambassadors, or Pope John Paul II seeking the psychological safety of a Polish dumpling, food is never just sustenance.
Never.
It is the physical manifestation of memory. It's a tool for power. It is identity, plated, and served.
That perfectly synthesizes the journey we've taken through these sources. And, it leaves us with an important mechanism to consider regarding our own lives.
Oh, how so?
Well, we have spent this time analyzing how a global leader's eating habits provide a window into their governance, their psychology, and their values. But let's turn that analytical mirror on you.
Okay, listener, listen up.
Consider your own daily eating rituals. If a historian, hundreds of years from now, were to evaluate you solely based on how you consume your food, whether you eat lunch frantically while staring at a screen, or whether you prioritize taking the time to share meals with your family, what would they see?
Oh, that's deep. Or even what specific childhood comfort food you retreat to when you are overwhelmed.
Exactly. Based on those choices, what kind of ruler of your own life would they assume you are? What does the reality of your plate reveal about the kingdom you are building for yourself every single day?
That is a phenomenal question. I might need to seriously reevaluate eating a protein bar while pacing around my kitchen every morning.
It's definitely something to think about.
It's a fantastic thought to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive behind the walls of the Vatican. Keep looking for the profound history hidden in your everyday routines. And remember, the next time you sit down to eat, you aren't just having a meal, you're making a statement. Catch you next time.